met a man more candid, fair, and honest. Everyone trusts him. Everyone trusts him. Or at least everyone that H.G. Wells saw or was allowed to see trusted Stalin. Wells likewise had been impressed by Vladimir Lenin, who he called a frank, refreshing, and amazing little man. An amazing little man. Wells' fellow socialists, who were the British socialists? One of the much slower Fabians. Learn the Fabian socialists. Very important. Much more similar to where a lot of our modern progressives are. His fellow socialists. George Bernard Shaw was very impressed with Stalin, and after meeting with Stalin said this: "We, meaning us in the West, we cannot afford to give ourselves moral airs, to be arrogant, superior, when our most enterprising neighbor, the Soviet Union, humanely and judiciously liquidates a handful of exploiters and speculators to make the world safe for honest men." You guys don't believe me, right? Let me read that again. "We cannot afford to give ourselves moral airs when our most enterprising neighbor, the Soviet Union, humanely and judiciously liquidates a handful of exploiters and speculators to make the world safe for honest men." And that was precisely what Stalin had told him, and he totally believed it. Shaw praised the utilitarian killing, quote unquote, that the Soviet Union was doing to, after all, make a better place. You know, as Lenin said, as Stalin said, you have to break a few eggs and make an omelet. Trotsky said, "We will not arrive in the kingdom of socialism on a polished floor with white gloves. Some blood will have to be spilled." One person who saw this, who was a leftist at the time, was Malcolm Muggeridge, the famous British journalist with the BBC, and later on became a big convert to Christianity as well. In fact, Muggeridge gets a lot of credit for introducing Mother Teresa to the wider West. Here's some of his work in the 1970s. But Muggeridge was a man of the left, went there in the 1920s, and was so shocked by what he saw in the Soviet Union, including the conversion of churches into atheist museums, that it had just the opposite effect on him. It did start him on his road toward being really a conservative Christian. But he talked about these Potemkin progressives that he observed in the Soviet Union. Here's what he wrote: "They are unquestionably one of the wonders of the age, and I shall treasure till I die as a blessed memory the spectacle of them traveling with radiant optimism through a famished Soviet countryside, wandering in happy bands about squalid, overcrowded towns, listening with unshakable faith to the fatuous patter of carefully trained and indoctrinated Soviet guides. They would repeat like school children a multiplication table, the bogus statistics and mindless slogans endlessly intoned to them. There were earnest advocates of the humane killing of cattle who looked up at the massive headquarters of the OGPU with tears of gratitude in their eyes. Earnest advocates of proportional representation who eagerly assented when the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat was explained to them. There were earnest clergymen I saw who walked reverently through anti-God museums and reverently turned the pages of atheistic literature. There were earnest pacifists who watched delightedly tanks rattle across Red Square and bombing planes darken the sky. There were earnest town planning specialists who stood outside overcrowded ramshackle tenements and muttered, 'If only we had something like this in England.'" Not only was Muggeridge mystified by this naivete, but so were Soviet officials. You should read some of their accounts. They couldn't believe how easy it was to mislead Western progressives. They were stunned. They're like, "This is really easy. This is almost too easy. Maybe we need to throw these people in the gulag. Maybe they're spies." Right? Muggeridge, the Soviet officials, the almost unbelievable credulity of these mostly university-educated tourists astonished even Soviet officials who were used to handling foreign visitors. I talked to Charlie Wiley, who was a very good friend with Herb Romerstein. They used to do the World Youth Festivals together, testified before Congress together. Charlie's still around. He's about 87 years old. And Charlie told me about going on a tour in Romania. And it was mostly progressives. He was probably the only anti-communist in the group. And after a couple of days, the guide kind of realized in Charlie that he could trust him, and he opened up to him, which was a very dangerous thing to do. And he said, "I could tell you're one of the only people that isn't being hoodwinked by all the BS that I'm feeding you here." And so they talked about it, and the guy said, "Maybe you could give me some advice. There's a few of us, the Romanians, what they had to do is they had to hire Western-educated Romanians because they spoke the language and they could deal with Westerners, right?" And he said, "Me and a few of the other guides, we're all total anti-communists. We don't like this stuff at all. But we can't believe how easily everybody accepts whatever we spoon-feed them. So we came up with this plan because we can't just tell them that we're lying for the state. So we came up with this plan to exaggerate beyond any possible ability. Like, and this comrade is a factory that is producing 10,000 tons of beef a week." And he said, "But it's an amazing thing we've learned that no matter how much we exaggerate, they just nod and say, 'Wow, this is amazing. I can't wait to go back home and tell all those red-baiting McCarthyites, what an amazing thing they're doing here in Romania.'" But Muggeridge saw the same thing. Said Muggeridge, "Interesting thing about these individuals, they were universally progressives. These fellow passengers provided my first experience of the progressive elite from all over the world who attached themselves to the Soviet regime, resolved to believe anything that they were told by its spokesman." Any psychiatrists in the room? Maybe this is something that a psychiatrist would have an easier time dealing with than a political scientist. But that's an interesting phrase. Resolved to believe anything that they were told. They went in wanting to believe. This was the brave new world, and they wanted it to be the brave new world. "They were mostly academics and writers," said Muggeridge, "all upholders of progressive causes and members of progressive organizations. They were ecstatic about playing a part in this drama of the 20th century. Ready at any moment to rush on a stage, cheering and gesticulating, a Western version of the devotees of Krishna, who throw themselves under the wheels of the great juggernaut." So that was Muggeridge. One of the Potemkin progressives was John Dewey, founding father of American public education. Columbia University professor. If you had to come up with a list of the 6 most important progressives of all time, Dewey would be on that list. He is an absolute icon. They have essentially photos of him in every education department framed on the wall in America. They don't have quite that. Everybody has to read his books. His books, including books like Democracy and Education, the 1916 classic, have been required reading in our teachers' colleges for literally about 100 years. Dewey was, one thing that they don't teach about Dewey in those programs is that the Bolsheviks absolutely adored his educational work. They began immediately translating his work into Russian as quickly as they could. They said, "Here in these writings of this would-be founding father of American public education is a blueprint for what we want to do in the Soviet communist totalitarian system." In 1918, Bolshevik Revolution 1917, right? Russian Civil War 1918 to 1921. In 1918, when they first started fighting the Russian Civil War, you think they'd have other priorities going on. 3 years after it was published in the United States, Dewey's Schools of Tomorrow was published in Moscow. In 1919, Dewey's How We Think was published in Moscow. In 1920, Dewey's The School and Society was published in Moscow. And then in 1921, Dewey's Democracy and Education, published in Moscow, even before the Civil War was over. Now, you might think here that for Dewey, you would stop and pause and think, if the Bolsheviks really like my stuff this much, maybe I ought to reevaluate what I'm doing. But Dewey was flattered. Dewey was honored by this, really impressed. There's a mutual admiration society developed. And in 1928, Professor Dewey joined a delegation of 25 American educators, mostly from Columbia, but other colleges in the Northeast, on a pilgrimage to the Soviet Union, so they could go over there and see this brave new world for themselves. Now, Dewey actually wrote about this later. When Dewey comes back, he's going to write a 6-part series for the New Republic. If any of you want to do some interesting research, I was going to have a chapter in this book on the New Republic being dupes, but I haven't done that. Somebody else, please do it. Okay, you won't be able to get through a few issues and just be blown away. I mean, it's just unbelievable how bad. If National Review had been this much of an apologist for a fringe right-wing regime, it would cease to exist. Everybody would remember it as carrying water for whoever. But the left, TNR, and they said they can get away with it. So Dewey said when he came back, he talked about, quote, the warning that was given to me that appears humorous in retrospect, so often given to me by my friends. And what was that warning? The warning against being fooled by being taken to so-called show places, right? So-called show places. He said, the Russians had enough to do on their own without bothering to set up show establishments to impress a few hundred or even thousand tourists. But he did note that places and institutions were shown to us, and they may well have been the best of their kind, but only in order that these places and institutions, quote, might be representative of what the new regime is trying to do, unquote. So Dewey comes back and he writes his 6-part series for the New Republic. He says, my mind was in a whirl of the new impressions that I saw in Leningrad and in Moscow. Readjustment was difficult, and I lived somewhat dazed by what I saw. Dewey was dizzied by this wondrous new world he was discovering. The outstanding fact, he wrote in the New Republic in his first piece, is Russia is in a revolution involving a release of human powers on such an unprecedented scale that it is of incalculable significance, not only for that country but also for the world. One of the things that he noted is he was especially impressed by the restoration of Russian Orthodox churches by the Bolshevik regime, and their interest in particular in preserving the art. And when I read the Columbia University Press book that collected all of Dewey's Russia writings, and they had that part where he hailed the restoration of Russian churches, the admiring editor from Columbia Teachers College put a gentle footnote on the bottom that said, apparently Professor Dewey was unaware of the vast attacks on religion in Moscow by the Bolsheviks. Dewey said he was especially impressed by, quote, the orderly and safe character of life in Russia under Stalin. He said he understands that this would be, quote, met with incredulity by probably much more than half of the European as well as the American public, but nonetheless, he saw something safe and orderly. And then he said this, he did allow for the fact that, well, certain people were being targeted. This is a direct quote, I'm not making this up. In spite of secret police, inquisitions, arrests, deportations of netmen and kulaks, despite the exiling of party opponents, including divergent elements in the party, life for the masses goes on with regularity, safety, and decorum. That wasn't a sarcastic statement. He meant that sincerely. There is no place in all of Europe, in fact, where the external routine of life is more settled and secure, said Dewey. By his 3rd article for the New Republic, he proclaimed the Bolshevik Revolution a quote-unquote great success. He was especially impressed by what was going on in the Russian public schools, because that's what Dewey was all about, right? Public schools. And Dewey was all about what in education? You guys know? Experimentation, right? Experimentation. So he called this idea on the Bolsheviks, he hailed the great experiment that was being done. Not because a lot of progressives were talking about the Soviet Union being a great experiment. He talked about the great experiment in education. He said, I think the schools are a dialectic factor in the evolution of Russian communism. And then he also came back at the very end in his final series, part 6. This is interesting. A lot of people don't realize this. One of the main reasons that they brought these progressives to the United States, or brought these progressives from the West to the Soviet Union at the time, they wanted Stalin, Lenin first, and then Stalin, badly wanted diplomacy